your title is called Fostering Student Engagement in Online Learning and Teaching. So away you go, Billy, and thank you very much.
That's great, Martin. Thank you very much. I'm glad I stuck in the extra couple of slides this morning now that you've given me that extra time. I don't know, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Super, thanks, Martin. As you said, like this presentation is on promoting student engagement in online teaching. I should set a bit of context for this first. For a start, I'm not really showing any great results of anything here. It's more, I suppose, a proposal stage, a piece of research, something I'm looking to go into much more depth over time. So I'm actually looking at doing a PhD in as it happens. So it's more kind of setting out an idea for something to do rather than reporting on something that's already done. But first of all, I'd like to set a bit of context, which is in terms of where, if you like, this has come from, which is what we've been talking about today anyway, which is COVID. So before I start, I suppose I was going to actually be a bit interactive and answers to a question, but you don't have to shout out an answer here. But I don't know if we have any art historians in the room or not, but can you identify what the major historical event is depicted on this particular painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder? Something that happened in the late 14th century. So just for a second, I would hope it's fairly obvious. So I say I don't want to ask people to shout out answers, but I hope you're thinking that might be like the Great Plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, call it what you will. And what interests me about that is not so much of itself, but what came afterwards. So that historical event, if you like, was followed by these historical events. So the Great Plague, historically speaking, was followed by the Renaissance. So in that sense, it's not unusual. This is something that that Helen King alluded to earlier, in that, like, as we evolve, like sometimes we have great leaps and revolutions. Sometimes we have great upsets that cause us to leap. So really, what this makes me consider is like what's happening to us educationally. So in terms of COVID-19. We've all been through what's been a very, very taxing time, obviously, and I don't want to make light of COVID-19 either. I'm quite conscious of I don't want to making jokes about the Black Death. But from a professional point of view, like, really the question is what happens after emergency remote teaching? Where do we go from with it? What do we use it for, in the sense of what learning do we get from it, rather? How do we take this, if you like, great period of upset, this discordance that we've had, and what learning can we get from it to inform what we do going forward? And over the course of the last year or so, like, personally, one of the things I've been most kind of taken with is actually student engagement. And student engagement is a tricky one, in terms of it's a phrase that we all use and we talk about a lot. It's like one of those pedagogical terms like active learning that gets a lot of, if you like, airtime. Yet it can have multiple meanings, and there can be a lot of confusion around what we actually are talking about when we're talking about student engagement. My concept of engagement may not be your concept. And as a catch-all term, it can be somewhat confusing. And you can see a couple of quotes there around that, one from Krauss and another from Gibbs, that is a catch-all term most commonly used to describe a compendium of behaviors. Or as Gibbs puts it, one of the more ubiquitous buzzwords now used to refer to so many different things that it's difficult to keep track of what people are actually talking about. So before going any further with student engagement, I think the first task really is to sort out, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about student engagement? What is student engagement? In what way are we looking at it? How are we considering it? How are we going to measure it? What exactly do we mean by engagement? So, as you can see, there are many ways of considering engagement. A couple of definitions I would be more taken with would be something like this. Again, this is Krauss again, saying that it's the time, energy, and resources students devote to activities designed to enhance learning at university. I should explain with that one that, like, my background, if like my area is science, chemistry. So like I like that one because that's very quantitative. If you're talking about like time, energy, and resources, that there are things you can easily measure. So I love that kind of definition, because that's something I can do a few Google Analytics on and get a bit of data on. Thank you very much. So that's quite measurable. On the other hand, you could look at student engagement and talk about being the extent or quality, always a tricky word, with which students are committed and actively involved in their learning. So that would take maybe a little bit more depth to explore. You're probably looking at it in a more qualitative sense. And so if you're talking about quality at all, well, how do you measure that? But you're looking there about being actively involved. So like the word active comes into that one, I suppose. So, there's lots of different ways of looking at student engagement, and lots of different ways of considering it, different lenses to look through. a recent study a relatively recent study I'm quite taken with is Petra Redmond's framework for online engagement. This is specifically around the online realm. And my interest from my research is specifically around looking at what we've been doing for the last year, looking at the work that we've done online. And a lot of the time it's been stressful, it's been inconvenient, it's been problematic. I'm not concerned about like criticizing it and saying what was so terrible about it. I'm more concerned with looking at it and going, well, what did we use that was useful? What did we use that we can continue to use? And in that sense, I suppose like what I want to do is to look at student engagement, look at online technologies, and look at the blend going forward. In many ways, I think the mistake that we could make is to come out of emergency remote teaching and go back into a face-to-face classroom and feel that that's the panacea, that's the cure to all our ills. Let's go back to the way things were and it'll all be better. It probably will be better, but I'd like it to be even better still. So, sorry, I kind of sidetracked myself a little bit there, but looking at Redmond's engagement framework, what Redmond did with her team, there's a number of academics involved in this, they would have done a very, very in-depth trawl of the literature. And what they would have done is come up with this framework where they've broken engagement into 5 different domains. So this is from a very, very extensive literature review. And they come up with 5 different domains: social, cognitive, behavioral, collaborative, and emotional. Now, if you look at face-to-face engagement literature, it's more likely going to deal with the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional. The cognitive behavioral, to me, are the 2 principal ones we've always looked at. Whereas with online engagement, social and collaborative start to come out to the fore more. And certainly that's been my experience in the last year or so, and my colleagues that I've spoken to, like where we feel that students are lacking that opportunity for collaboration. And you can certainly see how socially everyone is struggling with COVID, even outside of the classroom, like we're all struggling with that one. So you can certainly see how the collaborative social engagements have taken a huge hit over the last year, now that we can't be in a room together. We can't even read those social cues. Like you can't kind of see people's facial expressions as you're talking. I can't even see anybody I'm talking to at the moment at all, which is, as we all know, quite unnerving. So what Redmond did is broke the area of engagement into those 5 domains, and would have actually linked it to indicators as well too. Now, this is kind of just a quick summary of the indicators that Redmond and her team come up with, where you're looking at like the indicators for each of the different 5 types of engagement. So you could be looking at like social engagement, building communities, creating a sense of belonging, developing relationships, and establishing trust. You can see how they have been incredibly difficult to achieve online. Similarly with the collaborative, like learning with peers, presents challenge. Like breakout rooms have been a godsend to us in that regard, but they're not the same as face-to-face, unfortunately. Relating to faculty members, again, there can be issues there and so on. And the other ones, you can see the indicators for them as well too. But it's those 2 are more focused on the social and the collaborative, because they're the ones who've been struggling. Yet perversely, we have, in trying to address that, we have come up with techniques that have addressed that. We have come up with ways of actually collaborating online. And I suppose what I'd be looking to do, and I haven't quite worked out what techniques I'll use in my research, but what can you do going forward to encourage collaboration in online realm while we're back in the classroom, while we're in a blended domain in the future, if you like. So in terms of what you could do to foster that engagement, like, because Redmond actually, just to go back, Redmond's study isn't just looking at the theory and summarizing it. It's meant really to be a toolkit for critical reflection. It's meant to provide you with an aid to carrying out work yourself, to improving the engagement, if you like. So it's really meant to be a practical resource rather than an academic exercise. So in terms of like how you can actually use the framework like that, you need to find something to, if you like, to intervene, but you need to find some technology or whatever to use, and you just use the framework to assess the engagement, and then to try that and maybe assess how that trial went going forward. And so a source could be something like that companion active learning out there. That's something that anyone from IT might be familiar with. It's just something that's published this year by Michael Ryan, who I think is in the other parallel session, and colleagues. And it's just kind of summarizing active learning compendium. Now, a lot of this is face-to-face stuff. Some of it, the part 1 is just listing, if you like, kind of like the from the literature, the different active learning techniques we can use. Part 2 is a bit that interests me. It's compiled by RLTC staff, where it's using things that people have are basically relating to people have used themselves. In the online realm, I think there's a couple of things, and colleagues of mine were using discussion forums and creating videos and so on. That I think that may well tie into my work, possibly, or there are lots of other sources. Like aside from that, like as I said, my area is chemistry, science. So like science education is where I probably would have the most interest. And just this slide is just summarizing a couple of possible sources. Now, in terms of my own research, I really haven't got into this properly yet. But like here's some example of like kind of online or digital resources there, or techniques or technologies that can be used going forward. Some that one like the Peerwise one, bottom right, is one I've been using for years. Actually, it's around writing MCQ questions. Students write their own questions, answer each other questions, critique each other's questions. It's a whole collaborative online resource. It's one I've been using for quite some time, and I'm a big fan of. Whereas if you look, say, like the lab archives in top left corner there, that would be specific to, well, how do I kind of deliver labs online, which is a big issue I've had to struggle with over the last year, and that could be innate to that. Or similarly, top middle pre-lab videos, where you're kind of, if like that's a flipped classroom type approach, in the sense that like you show students videos of what they can do in the lab. Now you can use that for face-to-face labs as well too. This is something that you could use in advance of coming in to carry out a face-to-face lab, to save you like the demonstration time in the lab. And that's something that we were lucky enough in my department to have limited on campus time in labs, but only half as much as they usually have. So that sort of approach was very helpful over COVID, where you can actually show them what you're doing before they come in, so they could maximize their time actually working physically in the lab, not to be wasting time watching me showing them in the lab time. So these are just ideas that could be used to promote engagement. So like for my own research going forward, what I'd be using would be an action research report, where I would decide on a framework. That's my Redmond framework. Source and intervention, it could be one of those 5 examples in the previous slide. It could be something in the compendium, could be something that I used over COVID, something a colleague used over COVID, something I picked up from one of the other presentations today. But the thing is then to apply the intervention and then evaluate the intervention, which of course is the critical part. That's where the student voice comes in. It's that evaluation of the intervention that really will be critical in my research. Like, what will I get back from students? How well did that work? So from my research point of view, yeah, that's how I'll do it. But I suppose now that you've wasted this much time listening to me, I would hope that people might get something out of this for their own practice. This is something that could be done on a much smaller scale. We could, we do this kind of thing all the time. But if you can find something from literature like my example of the Redmond framework, if you can then take a technology, or this may not be online, you could take a face-to-face approach, something from the compendium or whatever, and apply that in your class, apply that intervention and evaluate it. Your evaluation could be as simple as a 1-minute paper at the end of the class. Get some student feedback on how trying something new, and we've all been exposed to plenty of new stuff over the last year. If you think about it, like, it's been a fantastic experiment in a way, one you certainly would never have got ethical approval for, to do what we've done in the last while. So there's been huge learning in that year, and like I suppose my kind of motivation is to take that forward and use it constructively into the future. But whatever you do, if I can just leave you this thought from Michael Seary, who's a kind of a science ed researcher. Thank you, Martin. Nearly done. A science ed researcher I have a lot of time for. Michael was saying here, to enhance the effectiveness of technological interventions, we must individually decide in our own modules what problems or issues we wish to overcome, how we intend to harness technology to address the delivery of content so it would be of value to all concerned. And Michael, we've done a lot of work on flipped classroom stuff in that regard. But again, if you look at the personal aspect of that, if you can take that yourself and apply that in your own little intervention, get your student voice evaluation, as I say, it can be very kind of simple, straightforward, doesn't have to be a major piece of research, and hopefully like we can all from here learn from COVID, go on and make our little evolutionary jump. Again, you could apply this even face to face. I was very taken by something Helen said earlier along the lines, is like, in terms of engagement, it isn't always a problem online. We can't, just a quote from Helen earlier in the keynote, we can't make comfortable assumptions simply because they've turned up. That really struck me from earlier. I just wanted to kind of pick that one out. Like, what I'm talking about is online, but putting everyone back in the classroom doesn't necessarily fix it either. So I think I'll leave it at that. I say I'm in the last minute, Martin. There's some references there as well, and if anybody wants to get in touch, easy enough, email billy.madden@lit.ie. Thank you everyone for your time and for your attention. Cheers.
Thanks, Billy. Really interesting.